Hello there, I'm Nafisa Latic and this is Across the Balkans. And since it's Ramadan, we are taking a look at the region's Muslims. Islam is the second largest religion in Europe after Christianity, and the oldest Muslim communities there live in the Balkans. They emerged during the Ottoman presence in the region from the 14th century until the end of World War I. Since then, their plight has not been easy. They faced displacement, massacres, and discrimination, leading to a massive reduction in population. Muslims in Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and Kosovo still make up more than half of the country's population. But in places like Serbia and Croatia, they are a tiny minority. Yet, Croatia is often held up as a model for how Muslim minorities can be a seamless part of European society. Aksel Zaimovic went to find out why.
Welcome to Croatia, the youngest EU member state and a rising tourist destination. On the surface, it appears a fairly homogeneous society. 90% of the country are ethnic Croats and Christian. But it's home to around 24 ethnic minorities and 63,000 Muslims.
Kako je biti musliman u Hrvatskoj?
Pa meni osobno, meni je sasvim u redu.
Islam u Republici Hrvatskoj je kao islam svugdje. Znači, nema različitih vrsta.
While Islamophobia is on the rise in several European countries, Muslims here live in peace.
Islam i muslimani se ne tretiraju kao neko strano tijelo. Nešto što je došlo, već nešto što već postoji, nešto s čim mi živimo, komuniciramo, dijalogiziramo.
But what's the secret to living in harmony? I'm Aksel Zaimovic, and I'm in the capital Zagreb to find out. It's 4 p.m. Zagreb's only mosque, the focal point for Muslims living here. It's the holy month of Ramadan, the most important for Muslims across the globe. Many have gathered to listen to verses of the Quran. Hafiz Aziz Alili is the Imam here. He is well known among Muslims in the Balkans for his distinctive voice and a style of reciting. It's part of the tradition to recite aloud while others listen.
Moglo bi se reći da je za naše narode, znači od balkanskih muslimana, ali ima taj način, dakle, shodno hadisu Božeg poslanika da je Džibril alejselam preslušavao Božeg poslanika ne samo jedno, nego 2 puta u mjesecu Ramazanu, i to je ta jedna vrsta kao sunneta, znači hafizi. Hafizka mukabele je zapravo nama najzanimljiviji, jer hafizi zapravo obnavljaju to svoje znanje, svoje učenje tokom Ramazana.
There's a rising number of young Muslims here following in his footsteps. They're Europeans, but also proud of their Muslim identity.
Kako je biti musliman u Hrvatskoj?
Pa meni osobno, meni je sasvim u redu. Imam prijatelje i muslimane i nemuslimane. Svi znaju da smo muslimani. Prihvaćaju to sasvim u redu. Nikad nije bilo nekih, ajmo reći, većih problema. Znamo se zezat po tom pitanju i takve stvari, ali sasvim u redu.
Islam is not a new religion here. It almost certainly came with the expansion of the Ottoman Empire in the 15th century. Fast forward 600 years, and it's now the fate of 1.5% of the population. This is Aziz Hasanovic. He's the president of the Croatian Islamic community, a voice of Muslims in the country.
Naša prednost jeste što smo internacionalna zajednica i okupljamo sve te nacionalne skupine, da kažemo, iz cijeloga svijeta, ali i za njih odvajamo prostore ako žele nešto svoje običajno. Znači, vjera je ista svugdje. I mi želimo da stavljamo naglasak na tom vjerskom okupljanju, da je to jedna nit koja nas sve povezuje.
But elsewhere in Europe, the reality is much more grim. There's a spike of hate crimes against Muslims. The French Senate has recently voted to ban the hijab, which could further stigmatize its Muslim minority.
Europa ovom pitanju pristupa vrlo licemjerno. Ako za sve se može naći rješenje, može se naći i rješenje za muslimansko pitanje, a ne prepustiti tim raznim desničarskim političkim krugovima da to koriste uvijek kako bi zastrašivali vlastiti narod od muslimana koji tamo dolazi ili od muslimana koji tamo živi. Islam i muslimani nisu prijetnja za Europu, oni su jedan veliki izazov da Europa upozna jednu kulturu, da upozna jednu civilizaciju.
That's what the government here did. Croatia recognized Islam in 1916 as a state religion. Since then, the Islamic community has been acknowledged as a legal representative of all Muslims. It means their rights are guaranteed by the Constitution.
On definira naša prava u vojsci, u policiji, u zatvorima, u školama, u vrtićima, formiranje škola, formiranje fakulteta, formiranje vlastitih vrtića, formiranje vakufa, gradnja islamskih centara, pravo na građanski brak sa učinkom, na šerijski brak sa učinkom građanskog, vrijeme za džumu namaz da je slobodno, bajrami da su slobodni, prehrana u javnim institucijama, ali i uzdržavanje vjerskih službenika. Na taj način su muslimani ovdje dobili jedan status ravnopravnosti, nisu diskriminirani, nisu u nekakvoj drugom redu ili ne osjećaju se drugorazrednim jer faktički imaju sve ono što i drugi građani katolici koji su većinski ovdje imaju.
So, does Croatia's successful model of integration just boil down to equal legal rights? Meet Nera Kadić-Meškić. She runs the Center for Cultural Dialogue, an NGO that promotes understanding between different faiths. It's dismantling prejudice against minorities.
Vizija centra jeste otvoreno društvo koje je naklonjeno i prakticira dijalog sa idejom da svi članovi, odnosno svi građani društva imaju jednaka prava. Namjera naše aktivnosti nije da neko suživljava s nekim, nego da istinski zajednički žive i njeguju taj jedan zajednički život gdje prihvataju jedni druge shodno njihovim različitim identitetima.
Kakva su vaša iskustva na terenu nekako kad radite i razgovarate sa ljudima?
Mi smo jedinke koji su integrirane jako dobro u ovo društvo i naravno da je lijepo da vodimo taj dijalog i da objašnjavamo drugima što je to islam, da budemo ambasadori islama. Mi smo tu oni koji predstavljamo islam i koji znamo njima reći u stvari što je to istinski islam. A s druge strane, jako je važno i da znamo i naše susjede, odnosno ljude s kojima idemo u školu, ljude s kojima idemo na posao, da poznamo njihovu religiju, njihove običaje. I ovdje je jako prisutno to međusobno uvažavanje i poštivanje gdje se zajedno slave različiti religijski praznici.
They got me thinking, I want to see how Ramadan is being observed by Muslims here. And where else to do that than in the city of Rijeka. It's home to Croatia's second largest Muslim community and one of the country's newest mosques. I arrived just before the noon prayer.
Congregational prayers are a big part of life for Muslims. This time of year, this mosque would normally be packed with worshippers, but because of the pandemic, so many people have decided to stay at home and so many activities have been put on hold. I'm actually very keen to find out how Muslims in Croatia keep their faith alive during these unprecedented times.
Vjernici unutar svojih domova, kuća vrlo često se raspituju na koji način organizirati džemat, na koji način oni mogu zajednički sprovoditi vjerske aktivnosti u svojim domovima, u svojim kućama, sa svojim porodicama, što je jedan opet pozitivan primjer u ovim okolnostima da ipak muslimani se trude održati isti duh, istu razinu, da kažem, praktične vjere u ovom Mubarek mjesecu Ramazanu, kao što su to činili kolektivno zajednički u džamijama, gdje je sad to reducirano, odnosno gdje posebna pravila važe.
As the sun sets, the call of prayer marks the end of the day's fast, and with it begins an evening of feasting. But this year, only among family members inside the home. Communal meal sharing is not an option, but instead the faithful focus on voluntary prayers. Just like in Zagreb, Muslims here have never been seen as outcasts, but an equal part of society.
Islam u Republici Hrvatskoj je kao islam svugdje. Znači, nema različitih vrsta. Ja nisam za to da ima nekakav evropski islam, da ima nekakav hrvatski islam. Ja sam protiv one kovanice euro-islam i tako dalje. Islam je kao po definiciji svugdje isti i on je takav kakav jeste, ali primjena islama ili život po islamu je razlikuje se od zemlje do zemlje, ovisno o pravnim okvirima u kojima on djeluje. Mogu slobodno kazati da je Hrvatska riješila to na jedan najbolji mogući način.
Mi stalno promoviramo integraciju, a ne asimilaciju i to se može postići jedino kroz dijalog i učenje kulture dijaloga.
This model really seems to be working in Croatia. Religious rights are enshrined in the constitution without compromising Croatia's secular state. There's an environment of mutual respect and understanding, and a place everyone can call home. Aksel Zaimovic, TRT World, Zagreb.
At one point, under the Ottoman Empire, there were nearly 300 mosques in Belgrade, including at the site of the current National Assembly of Serbia. Now, if you exclude a handful of smaller places of worship scattered across the Serbian capital, there's only one mosque that remains a landmark for the local community. Aadel Haleem visited the 400-year-old building to find out what life is like as a religious minority in Belgrade.
This is the only mosque in Belgrade for 20,000 Muslims. The city, with a population of 1.7 million people, is overwhelmingly Orthodox Christian. With a faith based on community, congregational prayers like this one are especially important. The Bayrakli Mosque dates back to the Ottoman Empire and holds a special place in the heart of Muslims in the Serbian capital.
Družimo se s ljudima, proširujemo iskustva, slušamo neka nova iskustva.
But that's no easy task. Mirsad Terminjats drives from the outskirts of the city every week.
Živim trenutno u Obrenovcu. Dolazimo ovdje svakog petka na džuma namaz u Bayrakli džamiju. Ona nam znači sve.
The fact that calm, peaceful Fridays are a part of life here is welcome news in a city and region that's seen its share of turbulence. The mosque has been targeted before. The last attack happened 15 years ago. Imam Ramadan Mehmedi was there.
Eğer bakarsak 2004'te tabii siyasi bir sıkıntı ama burada Veniş'teki cami yandı. O zaman ben öğrenciydim burada. Burada yaşıyordum o zaman. O da maalesef üzücü bir şey. Yani siyasi bambaşka, din bambaşka olmalı bence. Çünkü herhangi bir ırk Müslüman olabiliyor. Ama o siyasete ve siyaset açısında eğer bakarsak ve din eğer geçerse tabii sıkıntılı olacak.
Actually, those people used that opportunity to try to prove something. I don't know what they were trying to prove, but actually the whole community here in Belgrade did another thing, that we were all against it, and very quickly we did some work on the mosque, and I think that's a very harmful episode for all of us here in Belgrade, because that's not Belgrade, that's not Serbia.
It's been 50 years since Rejo Nukic moved from what is today Bosnia to Belgrade. The retired imam says many other people also left, but left the religion behind as well.
Najmi je teže bilo kada sam dolazio u džamiju i nema ni jednog čovjeka u džamiji. Proučim ezan, okrenem se, nema nikoga. To su mi bili najteži trenuci. Nije bilo džematlija, jer ljudi su bili, kako kažu, zaifni, hafif u vjeri. Znači, oni su otišli davno iz svojih sredina i normalno da su morali da se prilagođavaju drugim narodima, sredinama i tako dalje. Pa vi to i danas imate, recimo, gdje će ti doći musliman u svoju sopstvenu kuću i kazati dobroveče.
The community says its numerous petitions to open more mosques repeatedly fall on deaf ears and raise eyebrows about Serbia's commitment to minority rights, a key factor in determining a country's readiness to join the European Union. A 2016 EU progress report stated, "The rights of persons belonging to a national minority to establish and register religious institutions, build and use places of worship need to be fully guaranteed in practice." Professor Yaya Ferhatovic says that's not happening. He's an MP with the Justice and Reconciliation Party, representing Serbia's Bosnian minority.
Poslije rata u bivšoj Jugoslaviji problem da se država umiješala u instituciju islamske zajednice, u duhovno jedinstvo svih muslimana, bošnjaka, jer je primarno centar svih muslimana Sarajevo. Naravno, ovoj državi to nije odgovaralo, pa je onda pokušavala da razbije to duhovno jedinstvo na taj način što će instalirati paravjersku tvorevinu.
Ferhatovic says Belgrade used to be the place where people would come for a better life, but that has changed. He says one mosque in a city the size of Belgrade is not enough.
Naravno da to nije ni dovoljno, da je to mnogo manje od dovoljnog. Muslimani ovdje u Beogradu su organizirani pored ove Bajrakli džamije u mešdžidima. Do skora nismo imali ni parcelu muslimanskog groblja. Eto, zahvaljujući zalaganju naše stranke, naših kadrova, muslimani su ovdje u Beogradu dobili posebnu parcelu na koju se prema muslimanskim običajima, tradiciji mogu kupavati, koja će biti isključivo za muslimane. Do sada je to bilo u miješanim sredinama.
He says few Muslims show their faith in public, preferring to keep their religion confined to their homes.
Međutim, to što se dogodilo 90-ih, krenuši od 92. Pa onda završno sa 95. i s ovim stravičnim zločinima i genocidima i Srebrenicom i tako dalje, doprinijelo je da veliki broj onih kozmopolitskih, iskrenih Beograđana, ne samo muslimana, nego Srba, napusti ovaj grad.
For many, the importance of the mosque goes beyond worship.
Bu cami ve diğer mescitler sadece namaz için açmıyoruz. Orada çocuklara okutuyoruz. Onlarda terbiye veriyoruz orada. İşte nasıl daha iyi halk arasında daha iyi bir Müslüman olsun diye çaba gösteriyoruz. Mescit olmazsa, cami olmazsa tabii korkuyoruz. Çünkü yarın işte kızımız kiminle evlenecek, nasıl yaşayacak, ne yapacak, ne edecek diye çok soru işaretleri var kafamızda. Biz tabii bunu en yakın zamanda çözmeye çalışıyoruz. O yüzden cami, mescitler daha fazla açmak istiyoruz. Nerede Müslüman varsa orada mutlaka bir mescit olmalı.
I don't have an expression or feeling that actually there should be more mosques, because I suppose if there's a need for another mosque, it would be built, obviously.
With a shortage of places to pray, community members gather in homes or makeshift mosques. Authorities tore this illegal one down 3 years ago in northern Belgrade. While the future of Bayrakli Mosque is unknown, Nukic says its historical significance is undeniable.
Džamija će ova imati uvijek džemat. Bajrakli džamija će uvijek imati džemat. Zavisit će samo ko vodi Bajrakli džamiju. Nažalost, ja moram da kažem, mi smo taj džemat skupili, međutim, iz tog džemata je krenula jako ružna stvar, podjela muslimana u Srbiji i u Bosni. Iz ove džamije.
A congregation that vows to stand shoulder to shoulder, even if space is limited.
Nije dovoljna, naravno, trebalo bi mnogo više, ali tu stalno su gužve, nekad se desi pa izađemo i van džamije, moramo da obavimo taj namaz. To znaju i predstavnici ovoga grada i znaju i predsjedništvo zna. Radi se na tome verovatno, ali kao što vam kažem, vremena su teška, sve teško ide i sve sporo ide, tako da valjda će to jednog dana zaživjeti, valjda ćemo jednog dana u Beogradu imati još bar jednu džamiju, ali eto, da će dragi Bog opet.
A hope shared by hundreds here and thousands across the city that one day their collective prayers will be answered.
My guest today is Marko Attila Hoare, who is a Balkan historian and the author of the book The Bosnian Muslims in the Second World War, A History. He joins us now from Sarajevo. Marko, thanks so much for being here with us on the show. Historically speaking, what is the main difference between Balkan Muslims and Muslims living in Western Europe? Did the fact that they live in Europe for centuries impact in some way their view of Islam?
Absolutely. We're talking about Balkan Muslims who have been in the Balkans in Europe for as long as the Christians have. They have been there for centuries, and they converted to Islam after the Ottomans arrived from the 14th century. So we're talking about a community that's really grown up essentially culturally very close to the neighboring Christian population. And that's very different from Muslims who immigrated from other parts of the world with very different cultures just in the last couple of decades or few decades.
So how would you say they are different than the other Muslims, or let's say other Muslims living in other parts of Europe?
Well, for example, the process of secularization, which has Europe is a very secular culture, so the process of secularization and the rise of liberal values in terms of equal treatment of women and gay people, in that sense, the European Christians and Muslims are very much the same. But when we're talking about immigrants, not just Muslims, but other immigrants in general from other parts of the world, they often come from countries where the liberal values haven't progressed to the same extent. They don't necessarily have those same values, which is not to say that they're all the same, but nevertheless, you have different relationship to liberal values.
And are there common issues Balkan Muslims have faced throughout history and that they are still facing today?
Yes, there is still a problem with Islamophobia in Europe. So you've had, until recent decades, mass campaigns of persecution, ethnic cleansing, genocide directed against Muslims in the Balkans, in Bulgaria in 1989, in Bosnia-Herzegovina, in Kosovo in the 1990s. So these genocidal campaigns involved Islamophobic persecution. And these regimes which were engaged in these persecution did rely on Islamophobic ideas. And more recently, the rise of the far right in Europe has been Islamophobic in nature, in large part, and it has involved attacks particularly on immigrant Muslims. And to some extent, this has affected the indigenous Balkan Muslims as well.
Right, and you've been researching and writing about Balkan Muslims, especially Bosnian Muslims, for years now. Have you found any elements of radicalism during your research into Bosnian Muslims? I mean, we witnessed, as you mentioned, so many politicians in Europe, like the French president calling Islam a religion in crisis, Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orban seeing them as a potential threat to Europe's secularism, and even in the region a couple of months ago, Slovenian Prime Minister Janez Janša angering many Muslims by sharing an insulting tweet about Quran.
I mean, the incredible thing is that despite this persecution which Balkan Muslims have been subjected to in the 1980s and 1990s, the radicalization has been very limited. So the Muslims in Bosnia-Herzegovina and Kosovo and Macedonia have been very reluctant to join radical extremist Muslim groups or factions. They've been very slow and resistant to radicalization, very slow to radicalize, compared to some Muslim communities in countries like France and Britain. Of course, in France and Britain, we're still talking about a minority of Muslims who embrace extremism. Most Muslims in these countries are not extremists. But nevertheless, there's been a larger minority of Muslims prone to radicalization in France and Britain, for example, or the Netherlands, than in Bosnia-Herzegovina, Kosovo, Albania, Macedonia.
Right. And can Bosnian Muslims and their view of Islam be a role model for other parts of Europe in some way? I mean, is there such a thing even as a so-called European Islam?
Well, I would say that Islam is a very diverse religion, and there are many different currents within it. So I would hesitate to put forward one type of European Islam, but nevertheless, we're talking about Muslim communities in the Balkans that have been there for centuries and are very much integrated with the neighboring Christian populations for the most part. And that is quite a different experience from immigrants who have arrived recently. So it may be difficult for Muslims who've come from countries like Syria, Pakistan, Afghanistan and elsewhere to really follow the model of indigenous Balkan Muslims. But nevertheless, the process of secularization and liberalization can affect them too, just as it affects other religious communities as well.
Right. At the beginning of our show, we've seen a story from Croatia as a successful example of a Muslim minority there. They have been living there for centuries, as we were mentioning. One of them said integration, not assimilation. Is this the way forward?
Yes, I would say so. The point is that the Muslim minority in Croatia is quite a small community. We're talking about 60 or 70,000 people. Mostly people who have come from the former Yugoslavia, who are very culturally close to Christian Croats, and they're often culturally indistinguishable from them. So there isn't really much of a cultural divide between the Christians and Muslims in Croatia. And in that sense, it's been quite easy to integrate them. And Croatian nationalism historically was quite Islamophilic. It actually identified Muslims in Bosnia as the purest section of the Croat nation. So there is that heritage there. So to some extent, that is true that Croatia has been successful in that respect. Although there was also Islamophobia in Croatia as well, which rose particularly under the Tudjman regime in the 1990s. But overall, we're talking about a generally successful process of integration, which doesn't mean that Muslims lose their religion or they become identical to non-Muslims.
Well, nevertheless, Muslims through history, Muslims in the region suffered a lot. They've been massacred, they've been tortured, they've been raped. On one occasion, you said that, I was listening to one of your previous interviews, you said as a student you were interested in the history of Bosnia because you wanted to know more about the reasons for the war in the 19th and the creation of the Bosnia as a state. How big of a role did the religion play in the killings, torture and rape that we've seen in the Balkans?
Well, it was very significant. We're talking particularly about Serbian nationalism in the 80s and 90s, which was particularly Islamophobic. It was also anti-Catholic. It wasn't just anti-Muslim, but anti-Muslim and anti-Catholic, but particularly anti-Muslim, Islamophobic. So the whole ideology of Serb extremist nationalism was linked to rejection of Islam, rejection of the Ottoman legacy, hatred of Muslims in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, as in the case of Bosnian Muslims, people who allegedly betrayed their Serbhood by converting to Islam and becoming Muslims. I mean, in actual reality, this was about nationality as well. The problem was that these Muslims could not be assimilated into the Serb nation. They identified in Bosnia, they identified themselves as a separate nation. And that was part of the problem. So from the point of view of Serb nationalists, this identification of Bosnian Muslims as alien, both nationally and religiously.
Right. And what does the future hold for Muslims in the Balkans? As you were mentioning, rise of Islamophobia, I've mentioned a couple of statements from very powerful European politicians, especially because many of the countries in Western Balkans, they still want to join the European Union that has, let's say, different values maybe in some way. So who do you think they will turn more east or west? What does the future hold for them?
Well, I think they will turn more west because ultimately Balkan Muslims are culturally much closer to people in Western Europe, including Christian people, than they are to the Middle East, by and large. So, for example, Muslims from Bosnia or from Kosovo, from Albania, will rather emigrate to West European countries, to Germany, to Sweden, to Switzerland, to these places where they will integrate quite easily. Of course, there is a problem of Islamophobia in the West, but that's really linked to hostility to immigration, and that would affect people who are not just Muslims, but other other immigrant communities as well. But fundamentally, the Balkan Muslims are Europeans, and they will always feel closer to Europeans than they will to Muslims from outside Europe.
Marko, thanks so much for this insight for us here on Across the Balkans. I really appreciate your thoughts and your research that you've been doing about Bosnian Muslims specifically. Thanks so much. Marko Atilahoare, he's a Balkan historian. He was joining us live from Sarajevo.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thanks for watching this episode of Across the Balkans. Hope to see you next time. Bye-bye.